Imagine being locked inside one of the most secure prisons in America. Concrete walls, steel bars, guards watching your every move. For most people, escape is impossible. But there was one man who looked at those walls and saw nothing but a challenge. A man so clever, so calculated that he turned the entire Texas prison system into his personal playground. This man didn't escape from prison once, not twice, not even 3 times. He escaped 4 times in a row, each escape more brilliant and outrageous than the last. He impersonated judges, faked deadly diseases, and even staged his own death to fool the authorities. His final escape was so insane that it sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood thriller. Guards were left speechless, investigators were humiliated, and the entire justice system was forced to ask one question: how did he keep doing it? Today, we're diving into the unbelievable true story of Stephen J. Russell, the man who became America's greatest escape artist without ever firing a single shot or throwing a single punch. This is a story of pure genius, careful planning, and one man's refusal to stay behind bars. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear will leave you amazed. Our story begins in the early 1990s with a man named Stephen J. Russell. At this point in his life, Stephen seemed like an ordinary guy. He worked as an accountant for a company in Texas. He wore a suit to work every day. He crunched numbers. He filed reports. He lived a quiet, peaceful life with absolutely no criminal record. Stephen was smart, really smart. People who knew him said he had an incredible ability to understand complex situations and talk his way through almost anything. But despite his intelligence and hard work, Stephen's life was about to take a dark turn that would change everything. One day, without any warning, Stephen's manager fired him. The termination was unfair and completely unexpected. Stephen had dedicated himself to his job. He had spent countless hours working late, sacrificing time with his family, doing everything the company asked of him. And in return, he got nothing but a pink slip and a cold goodbye. The betrayal cut deep. Stephen felt a rage building inside him that he had never experienced before. He looked around at the world and saw a system that didn't care about loyalty or hard work. He saw a system that rewarded the ruthless and punished the honest. Something inside Stephen broke that day. The anger and disappointment twisted his perspective on life. He went from being a law-abiding, peaceful man to someone filled with bitterness and hatred toward the system that had wronged him. Stephen made a decision. If the system was going to treat him like garbage, then he would beat the system at its own game. He decided to use his sharp intelligence and social skills for something the world would never forget. Stephen became a con man. He started small, running insurance fraud schemes. He would stage accidents, some of them genuinely dangerous, just to collect insurance payouts. He became skilled at lying, at manipulating people, at creating false documents. For a while it worked. Money started flowing in. Stephen felt like he was finally getting what he deserved. But every con artist makes a mistake eventually, and in 1992 Stephen's luck ran out. One of Stephen's insurance scams was discovered. The authorities tracked him down and arrested him. He was charged with fraud and sentenced to 6 months in Harris County Jail in Texas. 6 months doesn't sound like a long time, but for Stephen it felt like an eternity. He looked at those prison walls and refused to accept his fate. Stephen wasn't the type of person to just sit quietly and serve his time. No, he immediately started planning his escape. And here's the crazy part. He managed to pull it off in just 1 month. During his first month behind bars, Stephen became an observer. He watched everything. He studied the guards, noting when they changed shifts and how carefully they checked people coming and going. He watched the workers who entered the prison to do repairs and maintenance. And that's when Stephen noticed something interesting. These workers weren't permanent prison employees. They were contractors who came in occasionally to fix things or perform specific tasks. When they finished their work, they would simply walk up to the guard station, knock on the glass window, and the guards would buzz them out. No intense security checks, no detailed questioning, just a quick glance and the door would open. Stephen saw his opportunity. These workers wore civilian clothes instead of prison uniforms. They also carried handheld radios to communicate with each other while they worked. Stephen realized that if he could get his hands on civilian clothes and a radio, he could blend in perfectly. So he made a deal with someone on the outside. He convinced them to smuggle civilian clothes and a handheld radio into the prison for him. We don't know exactly how he pulled this off, but Stephen was a master manipulator. He knew how to find people's weaknesses and exploit them. Once Stephen had the clothes and the radio, he put his plan into action. He changed out of his prison uniform and put on the civilian clothes. He grabbed the radio and started walking around the prison casually, pretending to inspect things and speaking into the radio like he was coordinating with other workers. He looked completely natural. Nobody suspected a thing. After walking around for a bit, Stephen made his way toward the guard station. His heart must have been pounding, but he kept his cool. He approached the glass window and gave the guards a casual signal, the same one he had seen the real workers use dozens of times. The guards barely looked up. They hit the button, the door buzzed open, and just like that, Stephen walked out of prison a free man. It was that simple. 1 month into a 6-month sentence and Stephen was already gone. After escaping, Stephen didn't stick around Texas. He fled to Florida and stayed on the run for 2 whole years, from 1992 to 1994. He changed his identity and lived as a fugitive, always looking over his shoulder, but managing to stay ahead of the law. For 2 years, Stephen tasted freedom. But as we'll see, freedom never lasted long for Stephen J. Russell. One of Stephen's insurance scams was discovered. The authorities tracked him down and arrested him. He was charged with fraud and sentenced to 6 months in Harris County Jail in Texas. 6 months doesn't sound like a long time, but for Stephen, it felt like an eternity. He looked at those prison walls and refused to accept his fate. Stephen wasn't the type of person to just sit quietly and serve his time. No. He immediately started planning his escape. And here's the crazy part. He managed to pull it off in just 1 month. During his first month behind bars, Stephen became an observer. He watched everything. He studied the guards, noting when they changed shifts and how carefully they checked people coming and going. He watched the workers who entered the prison to do repairs and maintenance. And that's when Stephen noticed something interesting. These workers weren't permanent prison employees. They were contractors who came in occasionally to fix things or perform specific tasks. When they finished their work, they would simply walk up to the guard station, knock on the glass window, and the guards would buzz them out. No intense security checks, no detailed questioning. Just a quick glance and the door would open. Stephen saw his opportunity. These workers wore civilian clothes instead of prison uniforms. They also carried handheld radios to communicate with each other while they worked. Stephen realized that if he could get his hands on civilian clothes and a radio, he could blend in perfectly. So he made a deal with someone on the outside. He convinced them to smuggle civilian clothes and a handheld radio into the prison for him. We don't know exactly how he pulled this off, but Stephen was a master manipulator. He knew how to find people's weaknesses and exploit them. Once Stephen had the clothes and the radio, he put his plan into action. He changed out of his prison uniform and put on the civilian clothes. He grabbed the radio and started walking around the prison casually, pretending to inspect things and speaking into the radio like he was coordinating with other workers. He looked completely natural. Nobody suspected a thing. After walking around for a bit, Stephen made his way toward the guard station. His heart must have been pounding, but he kept his cool. He approached the glass window and gave the guards a casual signal, the same one he had seen the real workers use dozens of times. The guards barely looked up. They hit the button, the door buzzed open, and just like that, Stephen walked out of prison a free man. It was that simple. 1 month into a 6-month sentence and Stephen was already gone. After escaping, Stephen didn't stick around Texas. He fled to Florida and stayed on the run for 2 whole years, from 1992 to 1994. He changed his identity and lived as a fugitive, always looking over his shoulder but managing to stay ahead of the law. For 2 years, Stephen tasted freedom. But as we'll see, freedom never lasted long for Stephen J. Russell. In 1994, Stephen was running another insurance scam in Florida. This time he was forging insurance checks, a bold move that required precision and nerve. But investigators were closing in. They had been tracking fraudulent check activity in the area, and the trail led straight to Stephen. When they finally caught him, they discovered something even more shocking. Stephen wasn't just a con man, He was an escaped convict from Texas. The authorities immediately sent him back to Houston to face the music. When Stephen arrived back in Texas, he was facing serious time. But surprisingly, he made a calculated decision. He decided to serve out the remainder of his original sentence without causing any more trouble. Why? Because the remaining time was less than a year. Stephen figured he could do the time, get released legitimately, and then start fresh. So he kept his head down, served his sentence, and was released in 1995. When Stephen walked out of prison as a free man, he got a job working at a grocery store. He stocked shelves, worked the cash register, and collected a modest paycheck. For most people, this would have been enough. A steady job, a chance to rebuild, a clean slate. But not for Stephen. Working at a grocery store felt like torture to him. He had tasted the high life through his scams. He had seen what money could buy, and now he was back to barely scraping by. Stephen wanted more. He wanted luxury. He wanted wealth. He wanted to live the life he felt he deserved. So once again, Stephen started planning his next big move. This time, Stephen wasn't interested in small-time insurance fraud. He wanted to go big. He wanted to pull off a scam so perfect that it would set him up financially for years. Stephen started reading the newspaper every day, looking for opportunities. And then one day, he found it. There was an advertisement for a financial manager position at one of the most prestigious health insurance companies in America. The job paid extremely well and came with serious benefits. There was just one problem. Stephen had absolutely no credentials, no experience, and no qualifications for this kind of high-level position. But Stephen wasn't the type of person to let a little thing like reality stop him. Stephen's first move was to completely fabricate his professional background. He created a fake biography from scratch, filling it with impressive degrees from respected universities. He listed years of experience working for various insurance companies in important financial roles. He invented an entire career history that never happened. On paper, Stephen looked like the perfect candidate, but Stephen knew that a fake resume wouldn't be enough. If he was going to convince these people during an interview, he needed to actually understand the job. So Stephen went out and bought financial newspapers like the Wall Street Journal. He purchased several books on financial management and accounting principles. And then he studied. Hard. Stephen had always been intelligent, but now he was focused. He absorbed information like a sponge. He learned the terminology, the concepts, the strategies that financial managers used every day. He taught himself how to speak the language of high finance. Within weeks, Stephen had transformed himself from a grocery store worker into someone who could talk confidently about investment strategies and risk management. When the day of his interview arrived, Stephen walked in with complete confidence. He charmed the interviewers. He answered their technical questions perfectly. He told stories about his fake previous jobs with such detail and conviction that nobody doubted him for a second. The interviewers were impressed. Stephen seemed like exactly the person they were looking for. But there was one final hurdle. At the end of the interview, they asked Stephen for references. They wanted to contact his previous employers to verify his work history and performance. Most people would have panicked at this point, but not Stephen. He calmly gave them 3 phone numbers for his supposed former employers. Here's the genius part. All 3 of those numbers were connected to a call forwarding service. When someone dialed those numbers, the calls were automatically redirected to Stephen's own phone. So when the company called to check Stephen's references, Stephen himself answered the calls. He would change his voice, adopt different accents, and create entirely different personas. One call, he was a senior executive praising Stephen's incredible work ethic. Another call, he was an HR manager talking about how much the company missed Stephen after he left. Each reference was glowing, detailed, and completely convincing. The people calling had no idea they were talking to Stephen himself. Why would they? Everything sounded legitimate. The company was thoroughly impressed with the feedback they received. They offered Stephen the job immediately. Stephen accepted, and just like that, he had infiltrated a major insurance company. Now the real scam could begin. Stephen started working at the insurance company, and at first, he actually did his job well. He showed up on time, completed his work, and impressed his colleagues with his knowledge. But Stephen wasn't there to be Employee of the Month. He was there to steal. Using his position and access to the company's financial systems, Stephen began embezzling money. He moved funds carefully, creating false transactions and covering his tracks with fake documentation. The amount started small, but they grew larger as Stephen became more confident. Thousands of dollars flowed into accounts that Stephen controlled. Then, tens of thousands. Stephen was living his dream life. He bought expensive things. He lived in luxury. He felt untouchable. But Stephen made one critical mistake. He decided to refinance his house to get a lower interest rate. It seemed like a smart financial move. But when Stephen went to the bank, an employee noticed something strange. Large amounts of money were flowing through Stephen's account. Way more money than a financial manager should have. The employee became suspicious and started tracing where the money was coming from. The trail led directly back to the health insurance company where Stephen worked. The bank contacted the company's CEO. The CEO, along with senior executives, immediately launched an internal investigation. They dug through financial records and quickly discovered the fraudulent transfers that Stephen had been making. They saw the fake documentation. They saw the missing money. And then they discovered something even more shocking. Stephen J. Russell wasn't who he claimed to be. He had a criminal record. He was still on parole from his previous conviction. The entire biography, the degrees, the work history, all of it was fake. The company immediately contacted the district attorney's office. The news spread fast. Within hours, law enforcement knew exactly what Stephen had done. Stephen sensed that something was wrong. Maybe he overheard a conversation. Maybe he noticed people looking at him strangely. Whatever tipped him off, Stephen knew he needed to run. He rushed to several ATMs and managed to withdraw about $40,000 before the company could freeze his accounts. Then Stephen made a desperate decision. He thought he could slip back to his house, grab some valuable belongings, and disappear before anyone caught him. But the police were smarter than that. They had already staked out his house, waiting for him to show up. The moment Stephen approached his front door, officers swarmed him. He was arrested on the spot. For the second time, Stephen found himself in handcuffs heading back to jail. This time, the charges against Stephen were serious: embezzlement, fraud, identity theft, and violating parole. The bail was set at an astronomical $950,000. There was no way Stephen could pay that amount, especially since all his accounts had been frozen. For most people, this would have been the end of the road. But Stephen was already planning his next move. He had no intention of staying in prison. And what he did next was absolutely brilliant. Stephen had been locked up for less than 2 months when he decided to execute one of the most audacious prison escapes ever attempted. He picked up the phone inside the jail and called the Harris County Records Office. This was the same county where he was being held. When someone answered, Stephen didn't hesitate. He claimed to be Judge Charles Ham, the actual judge who was presiding over his case. Stephen's voice was confident and authoritative. He spoke like someone who was used to being obeyed. He told the employee that he was calling about an inmate named Stephen J. Russell. Stephen explained that there had been a secret appellate hearing that morning, and as a result of that hearing, the judge had decided to reduce Stephen's bail from $950,000 down to just $45,000. The employee on the phone was confused at first. This seemed unusual, but Stephen was prepared. He spoke with such certainty and provided so many specific details about the case that the employee's doubts began to fade. Stephen mentioned case numbers, legal procedures, and other information that made him sound completely legitimate. He sounded exactly like a judge would sound. The employee had no reason to believe this was a scam. After all, who would be crazy enough to impersonate a judge? So the employee did exactly what Stephen wanted. She went into the system and officially changed Stephen's bail amount from $950,000 to $45,000. Now Stephen had a new problem. He needed to come up with $45,000, and he needed to do it fast. If anyone discovered what he had done, the whole plan would fall apart. Stephen contacted a prisoner financing company. These companies provide bail money to inmates in exchange for fees and collateral. Normally, Stephen wouldn't qualify for their services based on their standard requirements. But Stephen was a master manipulator. He talked to them, convinced them, and somehow persuaded them to bend their own rules. The company agreed to post his bail. Within days, Stephen walked out of jail a free man for the second time, but Stephen's freedom didn't last long. The authorities in Harris County quickly realized something was wrong. Someone noticed the bail reduction and started asking questions. They investigated and discovered that no appellate hearing had taken place. Judge Charles Ham had never made that phone call. It was all a scam. But by that point, Stephen was already gone. He had left Texas and was hiding out in Florida again, specifically in the city of West Palm Beach. He checked into a beachfront hotel and tried to enjoy his freedom. But the police were already on his trail. They had been monitoring his phone calls and managed to trace his location. Just 5 days after his escape, officers arrived at the hotel and arrested him. Once again, Stephen was caught. Once again, he was sent back to Texas in handcuffs. This time, the charges against Stephen were serious: embezzlement, fraud, identity theft, and violating parole. The bail was set at an astronomical $950,000. There was no way Stephen could pay that amount, especially since all his accounts had been frozen. For most people, this would have been the end of the road, but Stephen was already planning his next move. He had no intention of staying in prison, and what he did next was absolutely brilliant. Stephen had been locked up for less than 2 months when he decided to execute one of the most audacious prison escapes ever attempted. He picked up the phone inside the jail and called the Harris County Records Office. This was the same county where he was being held. When someone answered, Stephen didn't hesitate. He claimed to be Judge Charles Ham, the actual judge who was presiding over his case. Stephen's voice was confident and authoritative. He spoke like someone who was used to being obeyed. He told the employee that he was calling about an inmate named Stephen J. Russell. Stephen explained that there had been a secret appellate hearing that morning, and as a result of that hearing, the judge had decided to reduce Stephen's bail from $950,000 down to just $45,000. The employee on the phone was confused at first. This seemed unusual, but Stephen was prepared. He spoke with such certainty and provided so many specific details about the case that the employee's doubts began to fade. Stephen mentioned case numbers, legal procedures, and other information that made him sound completely legitimate. He sounded exactly like a judge would sound. The employee had no reason to believe this was a scam. After all, who would be crazy enough to impersonate a judge? So the employee did exactly what Stephen wanted. She went into the system and officially changed Stephen's bail amount from $950,000 to $45,000. Now Stephen had a new problem. He needed to come up with $45,000, and he needed to do it fast. If anyone discovered what he had done, the whole plan would fall apart. Stephen contacted a prisoner financing company. These companies provide bail money to inmates in exchange for fees and collateral. Normally, Stephen wouldn't qualify for their services based on their standard requirements, but Stephen was a master manipulator. He talked to them, convinced them, and somehow persuaded them to bend their own rules. The company agreed to post his bail. Within days, Stephen walked out of jail a free man for the second time. But Stephen's freedom didn't last long. The authorities in Harris County quickly realized something was wrong. Someone noticed the bail reduction and started asking questions. They investigated and discovered that no appellate hearing had taken place. Judge Charles Ham had never made that phone call. It was all a scam. But by that point, Stephen was already gone. He had left Texas and was hiding out in Florida again, specifically in the city of West Palm Beach. He checked into a beachfront hotel and tried to enjoy his freedom, but the police were already on his trail. They had been monitoring his phone calls and managed to trace his location. Just 5 days after his escape, officers arrived at the hotel and arrested him. Once again, Stephen was caught. Once again, he was sent back to Texas in handcuffs. When Stephen went to trial this time, the prosecution threw the book at him. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison for embezzlement and fraud. Combined with his previous sentences and the additional penalties for his escapes, Stephen was now facing a total of 45 years behind bars with no possibility of parole. The judge made it clear that Stephen would serve every single day of that sentence. Most criminals would have been devastated by this news. But when the judge read the sentence, Stephen did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom. He immediately accepted the judgment without protest. He didn't ask for an appeal. He didn't argue. He just nodded and accepted it. Even the prosecutor was confused. The sentence was extremely harsh, and most defendants would have fought it. But Stephen had his reasons. What most people didn't know was that Stephen had met someone in prison in 1995. His name was Philip Morris. Philip was another inmate, and Stephen fell deeply in love with him. This wasn't just a casual relationship. Stephen was absolutely devoted to Philip. Many people believe that Stephen's repeated escape attempts were partly motivated by his desire to be with Philip. Stephen had accepted the harsh sentence so quickly because he was already planning his next escape. He didn't care about appeals or legal battles. He was going to get out his own way. And this time, he was going to pull off an escape so incredible that it would go down in history. After sentencing, the authorities didn't send Stephen back to Harris County Jail. They knew he was too dangerous. Instead, they transferred him to a maximum security prison in Texas. This facility was designed to hold the state's most dangerous criminals. The guards and prison officials were specifically warned about Stephen's intelligence and his history of escaping. They were told to watch him carefully and never underestimate him. But despite these warnings, the officials felt confident. This was a maximum security prison with state-of-the-art security measures. Cameras everywhere, multiple checkpoints, experienced guards. They believed that escape was impossible. They had no idea what Stephen was capable of. Stephen settled into his new prison and immediately started observing everything around him. He studied the routines, the security procedures, the weak points. And after weeks of careful observation, Stephen noticed something interesting. The prison had a medical wing where doctors and nurses worked. These medical professionals wore green and blue scrubs, which looked completely different from the prison guard uniforms. Stephen realized that if he could somehow make his prison clothes look like medical scrubs, he might be able to walk out the same way he had escaped before. The problem was that prison uniforms were white, not green. Stephen needed to dye his clothes. We don't know exactly how he managed this, but somehow Stephen got his hands on green dye and slowly transformed one of his prison uniforms into something that resembled medical scrubs. It wasn't perfect, but from a distance, it looked close enough. Stephen decided that he would execute his escape on Friday, December 13th, 1996. He woke up at 4 a.m. and went to breakfast early. After eating, he found a secluded spot in the prison where he could change clothes without being seen. He took off his white prison uniform to reveal the green-dyed clothes underneath. Now he looked like he could be a medical worker. Stephen started walking through the prison confidently, just like he belonged there. He had studied the medical staff's movements for weeks, so he knew exactly how they walked and acted. Nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned him. Eventually, Stephen made his way toward the guard station near one of the prison exits. He had been watching this particular guard for a while. Every morning, she spent most of her time talking on the phone and barely paid attention to people passing by. Stephen approached the glass window and gave her a casual wave, the same gesture he had seen medical workers use when leaving. The guard glanced up, saw someone in green scrubs, and without thinking, she pressed the button to open the door. Stephen walked through, and just like that, he was outside the prison walls. Freedom again. But Stephen knew he couldn't stay in the area. It wouldn't take long for guards to realize he was missing, and when they did, they would search the surrounding neighborhoods first. Stephen needed to get far away fast. He walked down the road until he came to a house. He knocked on the door, and when the homeowner answered, Stephen was ready with a story. He claimed to be a doctor who worked at the prison. He said he had been out drinking the night before, crashed his car, and now needed a ride. He explained that he didn't want the prison officials to find out about the accident because it would look bad for him professionally. The homeowner believed the story and agreed to give Stephen a ride into the nearest town. Once Stephen reached the town, he immediately flagged down a taxi. He told the driver that he was a surgeon at the Texas Medical Center in Houston and that he had just received an emergency call. He said he needed to get to the hospital as fast as possible because a patient's life was on the line. The taxi driver, believing he was helping save someone's life, drove quickly. When they arrived at the medical center, Stephen told the driver to wait while he ran inside to get money from his locker to pay the fare. The driver waited and waited, but Stephen never came back. He had slipped out another exit and disappeared into the city. Escape number 3 was complete. When prison officials discovered that Stephen had escaped again, they were humiliated. This was supposed to be a maximum security facility, and somehow Stephen had just walked out. The escape was a massive embarrassment for the entire Texas prison system. The authorities decided to bring in someone special to hunt Stephen down. His name was Terry Capps. Terry was the leader of the Special Operations Unit within the prison administration. He was known for being relentless and highly skilled at tracking down fugitives. Terry took Stephen's escape personally. He was determined to restore his organization's reputation by catching Stephen and bringing him back. Terry assembled a specialized task force whose only job was to find Stephen. They started their search in Huntsville, the town near the prison where Stephen had escaped. They interviewed people, checked security footage, and followed every possible lead. But Stephen was nowhere to be found. That's because Stephen had already left the area hours earlier. He had taken that taxi to Houston, and from there he left Texas entirely. Stephen traveled to Mississippi and settled in the city of Biloxi. Why Biloxi? Because it was a gambling town. Stephen figured he could win some money at the casinos and use it to fund his new life on the run. Meanwhile, Terry and his team were working around the clock. They were tracking down anyone who might have had contact with Stephen. They interviewed Stephen's friends, family members, and former associates. Eventually, they found someone who admitted to speaking with Stephen recently. This person revealed that Stephen was hiding out in Biloxi, Mississippi. Terry immediately contacted the city marshal and sent him recent photos of Stephen. The marshal distributed the photos to all his officers and told them to keep their eyes open. What happened next was pure luck. The marshal himself was walking down a street in Biloxi when he spotted someone who looked familiar. He pulled out the photo Terry had sent him and compared it to the man walking toward him. It was a perfect match. Out of all the places in the city, out of all the thousands of people, the marshal had randomly encountered Stephen on the street. He approached Stephen and arrested him on the spot. For the 3rd time, Stephen was caught. For the 3rd time, he was sent back to Texas in handcuffs. This time, the authorities added an extra 5 years to Stephen's sentence as punishment for the escape. Stephen was now facing a total of 45 years in prison, with absolutely no possibility of parole. The earliest he could even be considered for parole was after serving a minimum of 11 years. The message was clear. The state of Texas was done playing games with Stephen J. Russell. Stephen was sent back to the same maximum security prison, but now the guards were watching him even more closely. They had been fooled twice. They weren't going to let it happen again. Stephen was under constant surveillance. Guards checked on him regularly. His movements were restricted. For most prisoners, this would have been the end. There was no way to escape under this level of scrutiny. But Stephen wasn't most prisoners. He started researching and planning his most insane escape yet. During his research, Stephen learned about a special program that existed within the prison system. Inmates who were suffering from terminal or chronic illnesses could be granted parole and transferred to outside medical facilities if their condition was severe enough. This was done for humanitarian reasons and to reduce the burden on prison medical staff. When Stephen learned about this program, an idea formed in his mind. It was crazy, it was dangerous, but it just might work. Stephen decided to convince everyone that he was dying of AIDS. Faking a deadly disease is incredibly difficult. Stephen couldn't just claim he was sick. He needed to show symptoms. He needed medical records. He needed to make it completely believable. So Stephen began one of the most brutal self-inflicted ordeals imaginable. First, he started starving himself. He refused to eat most of his meals, and when he did eat, it was only tiny amounts. Over the course of several months, Stephen lost a dramatic amount of weight. His face became gaunt. His body became frail. He looked like someone who was genuinely ill. But weight loss wasn't enough. Stephen also forced himself to vomit regularly. He would make himself throw up to simulate the nausea and sickness associated with AIDS. He pretended to be weak and exhausted all the time. He would lie in his cell, barely moving, acting like he was too sick to function. Stephen kept this up for 8 months. 8 months of starvation. 8 months of making himself vomit. 8 months of pretending to be on death's door. The physical toll on his body was immense. But Stephen was committed to the plan. At the same time, Stephen was working on another crucial part of the deception. He needed official medical records showing that he had AIDS. Stephen managed to bribe a staff member who had access to the prison's medical files. We don't know exactly how much money Stephen paid or how he convinced this person to help him, but somehow he did. The staff member altered Stephen's medical records to show a positive AIDS diagnosis. Now, on paper, Stephen was officially sick. The prison doctors saw Stephen's deteriorating condition. They saw his dramatic weight loss, his constant vomiting, his weakness, and when they checked his medical records, everything seemed to confirm that Stephen had AIDS. None of the doctors thought to conduct a new test. Why would they? The records clearly showed the diagnosis, and Stephen's symptoms matched perfectly. They believed he was genuinely dying. Stephen had been pretending to be sick for 8 months, and it was working. The doctors started talking about transferring him to a hospice facility because they believed he only had a short time left to live. But Stephen wasn't done yet. He needed to take the deception even further. He needed to convince them that he was at death's door, that he could die at any moment. So Stephen came up with the most dangerous part of his plan. He was going to put himself into a coma. For several days, Stephen collected the sedative medications that the prison doctors had been giving him to manage his supposed pain. He saved these pills instead of taking them. Once he had enough pills stored up, Stephen took a massive overdose. He swallowed so many sedatives that he lost consciousness and fell into a real coma. This wasn't fake. Stephen was actually in a medically induced coma, and he stayed that way for 4 days. This was an incredibly dangerous gamble. Stephen could have easily died from the overdose. He could have suffered permanent brain damage. But somehow, he survived. When the prison doctors found Stephen unconscious, they were convinced that he was in the final stages of AIDS and that death was imminent. They believed he had only weeks, maybe days, left to live. The doctors approved Stephen's request for compassionate parole. He would be transferred to a care facility in Kennedy, Texas, where he could spend his final days in relative comfort instead of dying in a prison cell. Stephen had done it. Through months of self-torture and an incredibly risky plan, he had convinced everyone that he was dying. He was about to be released from prison. But Stephen had one more trick up his sleeve, and this one would be his masterpiece. Stephen was transferred to the care facility in Kennedy. He was finally outside prison walls, but he knew the authorities would still be watching him. Even if he recovered from his supposed AIDS, they would eventually realize he had faked the whole thing and send him back to prison. Stephen needed a permanent solution. He needed to make sure that no one would ever come looking for him again. So Stephen decided to fake his own death. From the care facility, Stephen made a series of phone calls. He called the prison authorities. He called the officials at the care facility. He called the parole office. In each call, Stephen pretended to be a doctor named Adam Roos. He claimed to be a specialist in AIDS treatment and research. Stephen explained that he had been developing an experimental treatment for AIDS patients and wanted to know if there were any inmates who might be suitable candidates for the treatment trial. Stephen Russell, the dying inmate, was the perfect candidate. The prison and care facility officials agreed to allow Dr. Roos to treat Stephen. Now came the brilliant final move. Stephen forged his own death certificate. He used the name Dr. Adam Roos as the physician who pronounced him dead. The certificate looked completely official, with all the right stamps and signatures. Stephen made copies of this forged death certificate and sent them to 3 places. He sent one to the care facility where he was staying. He sent one to the prison. And he sent one to the parole officer who was responsible for monitoring him. When these offices received the death certificates, they updated their records. As far as the state of Texas was concerned, Stephen J. Russell was dead. He had died from AIDS-related complications while receiving experimental treatment. They closed his file. Nobody would be looking for a dead man. Stephen was finally free. After weeks of recovery, He regained his health and strength. The months of starvation and self-inflicted illness had taken a serious toll on his body, but slowly he recovered. He was alive, healthy, and as far as the world knew, he didn't exist anymore. It was the perfect escape. Stephen had pulled off something that seemed impossible. But despite everything he had been through, despite the brilliant plan he had executed, Stephen couldn't stay away from crime. Old habits die hard. Stephen needed money to start his new life, and he needed a new identity. So he decided to forge a lawyer's identification card. Why a lawyer? Because having a lawyer's credentials would give him credibility and access to places most people couldn't go. Stephen walked into a printing shop in Houston and asked the owner to create an identification card that looked like those carried by attorneys. The owner was immediately suspicious. Something about Stephen's request didn't feel right, but the owner agreed to make the card anyway. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he was curious. Whatever the reason, he created the card and gave it to Stephen. After Stephen left, the owner couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He decided to contact the Houston police and report what had happened. He sent them a copy of the identification card he had made, including the photo of Stephen. When a police officer saw the photo, something clicked in his mind. The face looked familiar. He couldn't place it immediately, but he had a strong feeling he had seen this man before. The officer started digging through recent case files and bulletins, and then he found it. This man looked exactly like Stephen J. Russell, the escaped convict. But according to official records, Stephen Russell was dead. He had died from AIDS over a year ago. The officer immediately contacted Terry Capps, the agent who had been hunting Stephen for years. When Terry answered the phone and heard the news, he was stunned. Terry had believed that Stephen was dead. The prison had informed him that Stephen died from AIDS and had even shown him the death certificate. But now, seeing this photo, Terry realized the truth. Stephen had faked his own death. He had escaped again, and Terry had fallen for it completely. Terry couldn't believe it. Stephen had managed to fool everyone, including Terry himself. The death certificate, the medical records, all of it had been an elaborate deception. Terry assembled a new task force immediately. They were going to find Stephen Russell and bring him in no matter what it took. But finding Stephen wouldn't be easy. He had been living as a dead man for over a year, which meant he had been using fake identities and staying off the grid. Meanwhile, Stephen was in Dallas working on yet another scam. He walked into a bank pretending to be a wealthy businessman. He was trying to secure a loan of $75,000. Stephen was confident and well-dressed, playing the role of a successful millionaire. He talked smoothly with the bank's vice president, explaining his business ventures and investment plans, but the vice president was more careful than most people Stephen had conned before. Something about Stephen's story didn't add up. The numbers didn't make sense. The details were too vague. The vice president told Stephen to wait in the lobby while he went into his office. He told Stephen he needed to check some paperwork, but what he really did was call the FBI. He reported that a suspicious person was trying to obtain a large loan under potentially fraudulent circumstances. Stephen sensed something was wrong. He noticed the vice president was taking too long. He saw the way bank employees were looking at him. Stephen's instincts told him he needed to get out of there immediately. But he couldn't just run. That would confirm their suspicions. So Stephen did what he always did in tight situations. He started acting. Right there in the bank lobby, Stephen pretended to have a stroke. He grabbed his chest, stumbled, and collapsed to the floor. Bank employees rushed to help him. Someone called an ambulance. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and loaded Stephen onto a stretcher. They rushed him to a nearby hospital. At the hospital, doctors examined Stephen and admitted him for observation. He was placed in a hospital room with a guard stationed outside. The FBI had been notified about the incident at the bank, and they were sending agents to interview Stephen and investigate his identity. But Stephen wasn't about to sit around and wait for the FBI to figure out who he really was. From his hospital bed, Stephen picked up the phone and called the hospital's main administration office. Once again, Stephen was about to impersonate someone in authority. This time, he claimed to be an FBI agent. He told the hospital administrator that they had completed their investigation of the patient in room whatever number Stephen was in. He said the investigation had cleared the patient of any wrongdoing and that he was free to leave. There was no reason to keep him under guard any longer. The hospital administrator believed the call was legitimate. Why wouldn't they? The caller sounded professional and official. The administrator contacted the guard stationed outside Stephen's room and told him the patient was being released. The guard left. Stephen got out of bed, got dressed, and walked out of the hospital a free man once again. But this time, Stephen had made a critical mistake. He had left behind his driver's license with his photo on it. When the real FBI agents arrived at the hospital a short time later, they were confused. The hospital staff told them that the FBI had already called and cleared the patient for release. The agents immediately knew something was wrong. They had never made that call. Someone had impersonated a federal agent. The agents searched the hospital room and found Stephen's driver's license. They looked at the photo and the name. Now they had confirmation. Stephen J. Russell was alive, and he was in Dallas, Texas. Terry Capps received the news immediately. He gathered his team and headed straight to Dallas. They knew Stephen was somewhere in the city, and they were determined to find him before he disappeared again. Terry started by checking local hotels. His team went from hotel to hotel, showing Stephen's photo to desk clerks and asking if they had seen him. After hours of searching, they discovered that Stephen had stayed at multiple hotels over the past few weeks. He was constantly moving, never staying in one place for more than a couple of nights. This was classic Stephen, always staying one step ahead. Terry expanded the investigation. His team started interviewing anyone who might have had contact with Stephen. They talked to shop owners, restaurant workers, and business people in the area. Eventually, their investigation led them to an insurance company. The employees there told Terry something interesting. A man matching Stephen's description had contacted them recently. He had been asking questions about their policies and procedures. He told them he would be sending some documents via fax for them to review. This gave Terry an idea. If Stephen was planning to send documents by fax, that meant he would need to use a fax machine somewhere in the city. Terry requested the fax number that Stephen had provided to the insurance company. The team traced the number and discovered it belonged to a business center in a specific neighborhood of Dallas. Now they knew exactly where Stephen would be. Terry contacted the local Dallas Police Department and requested their assistance. Together, they set up an operation. They would stake out the business center and wait for Stephen to show up. They knew Stephen would need to use that fax machine again to send more forged documents to the insurance company. When he did, they would be ready to arrest him. The plan was solid. Terry positioned officers around the business center. They waited patiently, watching everyone who entered and exited the building. But sometimes, plans don't work out the way you expect. Before they could execute their carefully planned ambush, two detectives who were patrolling a nearby street spotted someone walking on the sidewalk. They looked at him closely and realized he matched the description and photo they had been given. It was Stephen Russell, just walking down the street, in broad daylight. The detectives couldn't believe their luck. They quickly moved in and arrested Stephen before he even knew what was happening. For the fourth and final time, Stephen J. Russell was caught. The incredible run was over. The man who had escaped from prison 4 times in 5 years was finally back in custody for good. The authorities in Texas were done being embarrassed by Stephen J. Russell. They had been humiliated too many times. Guards had been fooled. Judges had been impersonated. The entire prison system had been made to look incompetent. Now it was time to make an example of Stephen. They were going to make absolutely sure he never escaped again. Stephen was put on trial for all of his crimes. The embezzlement, the fraud, the identity theft. But most importantly, the escapes. When the judge handed down the sentence, it was shocking. Stephen was sentenced to 144 years in prison. Let me repeat that. 144 years. 99 years specifically for the prison escapes, and 45 years for the fraud and embezzlement charges. There would be no possibility of parole. Ever. Stephen would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. But the punishment didn't stop there. The prison system decided that Stephen needed to be placed in the most secure facility they had. They sent him to the Alan B. Polunsky Unit, a maximum security prison that housed Texas's most dangerous criminals. This wasn't a regular prison. This was a supermax facility where the absolute worst of the worst were kept. Most of the inmates there were violent offenders, murderers, and gang leaders. Stephen had never committed a violent crime in his life, but they put him there anyway because of his history of escaping. The conditions in this unit were brutal. Inmates spent 23 hours every single day in solitary confinement. They lived in small concrete cells with no windows. They had no contact with other prisoners, no television, no entertainment, just four walls and silence. For 1 hour each day, they were allowed to leave their cells for exercise and personal hygiene. Even during that hour, they were under constant surveillance. Guards watched their every move. Cameras recorded everything. There was no privacy, no freedom, no hope. Stephen J. Russell became the first person in United States history to receive a life sentence specifically for escaping from prison. Most escape artists get a few extra years added to their sentence. Stephen got 144 years. The message from the Texas justice system was clear. We will not tolerate being made fools of. Stephen has been in that same high-security unit since 1998. That means he has now spent over 25 years in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day alone in a cell, for over 2 decades. Most experts say that long-term solitary confinement causes severe psychological damage. It breaks people mentally. But Stephen is still there, serving his sentence. In 2010, Stephen's story was turned into a movie called I Love You, Philip Morris. The famous actor Jim Carrey played Stephen, and Ewan McGregor played Philip Morris, the man Stephen fell in love with in prison. The movie showed all of Stephen's escapes and portrayed him as a charming, intelligent con man who was motivated by love. Some people watched the movie and felt sympathy for Stephen. They saw him as a romantic figure who was willing to do anything to be with the person he loved. Other people saw him as a criminal who manipulated everyone around him and deserved everything he got. Over the years, Stephen has written about his life and his experiences. Even from prison, he has maintained that many of his actions were motivated by his love for Philip. He wanted to be free so he could be with Philip. He wanted money so he could provide a good life for Philip. In Stephen's mind, he wasn't just a con man. He was a man in love who was willing to do whatever it took to be with his partner. Whether you believe that or not is up to you. What cannot be denied is that Stephen J. Russell was one of the most intelligent and creative escape artists in modern American history. He never used violence. He never hurt anyone physically. He didn't tunnel through walls or cut through bars. Instead, he used pure intelligence, social manipulation, and carefully planned deception. He studied human behavior and exploited weaknesses in systems that were supposed to be secure. He impersonated judges and FBI agents with such confidence that trained professionals believed him. He faked a terminal illness so convincingly that doctors thought he was dying. He even faked his own death and made the entire state of Texas believe he was gone. Each of Stephen's 4 escapes was more elaborate than the last. The first escape with the civilian clothes and radio was clever, but relatively simple. The second escape, where he impersonated a judge and manipulated the bail system, showed his growing confidence. The third escape, where he dyed his clothes and walked out pretending to be medical staff, demonstrated his attention to detail. And the fourth escape, where he starved himself for months, put himself in a coma, and faked his own death, was absolutely extraordinary. It was a level of commitment and planning that most people couldn't even imagine. But in the end, all of Stephen's intelligence and all of his clever plans led him to spending the rest of his life in one of the harshest prison conditions in America. He is now in his 60s, and he will die in that prison. He will never be free again. He will spend every single day for the rest of his life in a small concrete cell, alone, with nothing but his memories and his regrets. So, what can we learn from the story of Stephen J. Russell? On one hand, his story is fascinating. It shows what the human mind is capable of when someone is determined and creative. Stephen proved that intelligence and planning can overcome almost any obstacle. He made maximum security prisons look like jokes. He fooled judges, FBI agents, doctors, and prison guards. For a brief period of time, he was unstoppable. But on the other hand, Stephen's story is a tragedy. He had incredible intelligence and talent. He could have used those gifts to build a legitimate, successful life. He could have been a successful businessman, a financial consultant, or anything else he wanted to be. Instead, he chose to use his gifts for deception and crime. And now he's paying the ultimate price. 144 years in solitary confinement. No chance of parole. No hope of freedom. No possibility of ever seeing the outside world again. Was it worth it? Stephen had a few brief moments of freedom between his escapes. He had some time with Philip Morris, the man he loved. He had some nice meals, some comfortable hotel rooms, and some moments where he felt like he had beaten the system. But now he sits alone in a cell for 23 hours every day. He will do that for the rest of his life. When you add it all up, the temporary moments of freedom don't seem worth the permanent punishment. Stephen's story also raises questions about the prison system itself. How did one man manage to escape from maximum security facilities 4 times? What does that say about the security measures that are supposed to keep dangerous criminals locked up? Stephen exposed serious weaknesses in the system. He showed that even the most secure prisons can be beaten if someone is smart enough and determined enough. In a strange way, Stephen forced the prison system to improve and close the loopholes that he exploited. Today, Stephen J. Russell remains in the Alan B. Polunsky unit in Texas. He is now a legend in the world of prison escapes. His story has been told in books, movies, and documentaries. People are still fascinated by how he managed to escape 4 times, using nothing but his intelligence and his ability to manipulate people. He never fired a gun. He never hurt anyone. He just talked his way out of prison, again and again and again. But legends don't change reality. And the reality is that Stephen will die in prison. The man who became famous for escaping will spend his final years in a place he can never escape from. It's the ultimate irony. The greatest escape artist in modern American history is now trapped forever. And that brings us to the end of this incredible true story. The story of Stephen J. Russell, the man who escaped from prison 4 times in 5 years using nothing but his brilliant mind and his gift for deception. A story of intelligence, determination, love, and ultimately, tragedy. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about Stephen's story. Was he a genius, a criminal, or both? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible true story like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.